Open your Bibles with me to Hebrews chapter 8. We will sort of start in Hebrews chapter 8. The opening phrase of Hebrews chapter 8 somewhat necessitates that we back up just a little bit. You can tell that the writer is getting to a point where he's zeroing in on his point, and Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 1 is the first evidence of that. Now of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. This is the main point. And so we of necessity need to kind of cover where we've been with the book of Hebrews. And I think it really sums it up in the last five or six verses previous to this, that we just read them, make some minor comments starting in chapter 7 and verse 24. Remember, we're doing this because Paul said, the writer said in verse 1 here, that this is the substance, this is the sum, this is the point that I'm making. And so let's start in verse 24 of the previous chapter and see Paul's point, remind us of where he's been most recently. But this man, because he continueth ever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. Paul has been describing Christ as the perfect great high priest, in contrast to the high priest and the great high priest of the Old Testament, who served the Lord in the tabernacle and served the Lord as best they could as long as life allowed them. And the brutal truth of it is, some of them not as best they could. That's just the way it is. That's just the brutal truth of it, that some weren't as dedicated to the Lord as you would have thought and should have been. But in contrast to that, this man, because he continueth ever, and he starts out the book with the eternality of Christ. He's been peppering the writings about the eternality of Christ, that he always was, he always is, always shall be. This one not flawed by sin, this one not stopped by death, this one, because he continueth ever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. The priesthood of that started with Aaron and the tribe of Levi, that was a changeable priesthood, constantly changing as folks died, as men died. This one had an unchangeable priesthood. So he is a perfect high priest. Perfect, and we'll see that perfection as we go through this. Verse 25, wherefore he is able, being a perfect high priest, he is able to save them to the uttermost that come to God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession. So in the first part of verse 25, he, as a perfect high priest, puts forth a perfect salvation. He's a provider, and he's not only the provider of that perfect salvation, it's bought and paid for with his blood, and he draws people unto himself to it. And we see in verse 25, he's able to save them to the uttermost. Here's my point that the author is making. Here's my point. We have a perfect high priest, and he is able to provide a perfect salvation. In the latter part of verse 25, that wherefore he is able to save them to the uttermost that come to God by him, seeing he ever liveth, and he gets that in there again, to make intercession for them. So he's not only the perfect high priest that provides a perfect salvation, but he's the perfect intercessor. He ever liveth to make intercession for them. For such an high priest became us. For this such an high priest, this kind of a high priest became us. He ever liveth. He never died. He never will. As God, he was perfect in his morality, and he became us. Such an high priest became us, and that's on the we'll see this basis of a perfect life. He became us, but he's holy. He's separate, sanctified, set apart, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, made higher than the heavens. He lived a perfect life. This perfect high priest provided a perfect salvation. He's the perfect intercessor. He never falls asleep. He never goes away. He never goes on vacation. He's the perfect intercessor. And all of that is based on his perfect life. He's holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, made higher than the heavens. Remember, this is the author's point. He tells us in chapter 8, verse 1, this is my point. He is separate from the Old Testament high priest on all these levels. Verse 27, who needeth not daily, as those high priests, who offer up sacrifice first for his own sins, then for the sins, then for the people's. For this he did once when he offered himself. So all of this, perfect high priest, providing a perfect salvation, and it's all based on a perfect sacrifice. The sacrifice of himself. He offered himself. In those words, and they're echoed later, those words are in contrast to the offering of another, to the offering of another lamb, the offering of another ox, the offering of another goat, the offering of another turtle dove. On and on the prescribed offerings go. This one, who has provided a perfect salvation, offered himself, offered up himself. I believe that was in chapter 9 and verse 14. How much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from every good works to serve the living God. So this is the underlying reason of why he's writing to them. Verse 28, for the law maketh men high priests, which have infirmity. I mean, just being born into it, just being born in the right family, just being of the right lineage by default, you're in that family of being in the priestly line. Well, the law maketh men high priests which have infirmity. But the word of the oath, which was since the law, maketh the Son, who is consecrated forevermore. We have now a perfect oath. And we read about that in the end of chapter 6, by those two immutable things. The end of chapter 6, Paul talks about the immutability of his counsel and confirmed it by an oath. This oath that is the promise of God. The law made high priests out of necessity. They were born in the right lineage. They were born in that family. But in contrast, the law maketh high priests which have infirmity, but the word of the oath, the promise of God, which was since the law, maketh the Son, who is consecrated forevermore. Now, of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. Here's the sum total. Every high priest that you can look at through the centuries of the high priest, every man that you could draw example from, every man that you could shine a spotlight on, they all had infirmity. Even the best of them were still sinners by nature. Even the best of them would have had to struggle with their own flesh, as Paul described the struggle in his own flesh in Romans chapter 7. And even after the best intentions and the strongest effort, eventually they died. And here's the sum. We have an high priest who is set at the right, on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. It reminds me to go back and think about, as he gets to his point, as he really sums it up and says, you have, those of you that are stuck in Judaism, those of you that are dabbling around and going back into Judaism, you have a high priest that's full of infirmity and flaw. And even if you can point to a good one, he's going to die. We have a high priest. Those of us that are followers of Christ, those of us that have trusted Christ, those of us that are counting on Him as to take on the role as the Old Testament priest, we have one who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. Think about the credentials. And we find it sprinkled throughout the New Testament, where Christ is seated on the right hand of the throne of God. We find it in Hebrews chapter 10. We find it, of course, in Revelation, and like we've been studying on Wednesdays. And think about the credentials. The great high priest that you have, you know by your human experience of your own that he's flawed. He's sinful. The great high priest that I'm talking about sits at the right hand of God. Which high priest are you interested in? You know, Paul's drawing a comparison to the listening ear. We have a high priest set at the right hand of the throne of God. Paul started this discourse back in chapter 2. We ought to take the more earnest heed. We ought to be careful to listen to the Word of God. He starts Hebrews out talking about God speaking His Word throughout the Old Testament and have in these last days spoken unto us by His Son. He starts this by, we ought to take the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we let them slip. Which is indeed what they were in danger of, letting them slip. And he says in verse 3, how shall we escape if we neglect so great salvation? The great high priest that Paul's describing, in contrast to the human high priest, he said, you got to take heed, earnest heed. You got to really pay attention to this. The difference is eternal in its scope. The difference is salvation, or trusting in a man, trusting in human effort, trusting in the work of a human high priest. You have salvation on the one hand with our perfect high priest that is a perfect intercessor that brings perfect salvation because he was ordained by the perfect oath of God, the perfect promise of God, versus those that are imperfect in every way. And salvation is on the line. The difference between the two is not just a little bit of a difference on how you get to the destination. We're all going to the same destination, just people take different routes. It's hogwash. There's only one route to God, and that's through Christ. And He's our perfect high priest. And remember, we've been talking a lot about He is our... The way that we have right standing with God is in Christ. The way that we have access to God is in Christ. And so he's reminding us, Christ is the exalted one. Christ, the credentials of Christ are heavenly. He sits at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. So he is not only our perfect high priest, but he's our high priest exalted. Verse 2, chapter 8, as Paul begins to develop, he's been making the contrast. He's been making the contrast over and over and over between the two. And now he's going to focus on the exaltation of Christ. He's going to focus on the elevation of Christ. Now, in our minds, we'll still be making some contrast, but he really begins to focus on lifting in the reader's mind, lifting Christ. So we have, he is a perfect high priest. Verse 2, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, and not man. This is another thing that we've been kind of running into in the book of Revelation. And he's going to deal with this in the next couple of verses. Verse 5. Moses was instructed by God to build the tabernacle according to the pattern. Moses was not given any creative license whatsoever. Moses was instructed very specifically, you build this. You build every piece of furniture. You build the coverings. You build the posts. You set them on the silver sockets. You do everything exactly how I told you. Moses could have been a brainiac guy, but he was raised in all of the underneath all of the best that Pharaoh had to offer. And he could have had all kinds of, in our day we would call them degrees and so on. And Moses might have said, Lord, you're building all this silver. Silver's heavy. We could use aluminum, whatever. Just some kind of innovation to make it better. The Lord said, listen to me, Moses. You build the tabernacle according to the pattern that I gave it. And you do not deviate. So intricate, we've talked about this many times, so intricate was some of the pieces, especially the mercy seat and the two cherubim that faced together on each side. So intricate was that, beaten out of a single piece, that the Spirit of God had to give the artificers special wisdom, special inspiration. The construction of much of this tabernacle was not even doable by men on their own, with their own intelligence and their own ingenuity and their own skill. Much of it, the Spirit of God had to give them inspiration so that they could complete the task. And completing the task was very important. Why? Because the tabernacle and its successor, the temple, were pictures of the heavenly. They're not only pictures, and we've made much about this, that every aspect of the tabernacle and its successor, the temple, was a picture of Christ. You take even the ark, wood overlaid with gold, humanity veiled in deity, and on and on and on the pictures go. On and on the work of Christ goes. And if Moses would fiddle around with the picture, if Moses would fiddle around with the architecture, if he would tinker with the construction, he'd mess up the picture. He'd mess up the image that was supposed to be there. And the image, verse 2, he's a minister of the sanctuary of the true tabernacle. Talking about Christ, the exalted minister. He's a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle. The heavenly tabernacle. The true tabernacle which the Lord pitched and not man. Not the one that Moses built. Not the one that Solomon built after that. They were to be very specifically obedient to the picture, to the pattern. Because what you're doing on earth is a mirror of what I've built in heaven. Now, I don't understand all of that, but I know that's what the book says. He's a minister of the saint, and we've run across it several times in Revelation, and we'll some more run across it in Revelation. We most recently did when he spoke about the golden altar up against the veil, which was closest to the ark, the presence of God. That's what we can see in our mind's eye, because that's what Moses built. And it was a picture of what God built. And as we're talking about this minister in the sanctuary, verse 2, we're talking about an exalted minister of the true sanctuary, of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, and not man. For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices. Wherefore it is of necessity that this man have somewhat to offer. The law required, and the pattern that we've been given requires. You read Leviticus 16 especially. You read the whole book of Leviticus, but Leviticus 16 speaks of the annual Day of Atonement and how the various ceremonial washings have to take place, the various offerings have to take place. He's offering first for his own sin, then the sins of others. This is the pattern set before us, and every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices. Wherefore it is of necessity that this man would have somewhat to offer. So verse 3 reminds us he's not only an exalted minister, but he's an exalted minister that's ordained by God. He's verse 3 is ordained to offer gifts. He's set apart, or appointed, I guess would be the better definition. He's appointed to that office, and he's appointed to that service, and he's ordained for that function. And our exalted high priest, he's a minister of the sanctuary, verse 2. The heavenly sanctuary, verse 2. He's a minister ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices. And the interesting thing about this, as we've already read, he became the gift and the sacrifice. He became both the gift and the sacrifice. He himself. He offered himself. He himself was the offering. And so Christ, our perfect high priest, was an exalted minister ordained for a very specific task, appointed for a very specific task. Titus, Paul writes in Titus a similar thought, chapter 2, verse 14. I mean, you can find this all over the scriptures. This is just a couple pages away. Who gave himself, and I read in Hebrews 9 where he offered himself for us, that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. Our great high priest. And remember why we're laboring this. This is the substance, the point that the writer is making to this point in Hebrews, as he's writing to those that some seemingly are struggling with their faith, struggling with continuance, struggling with walking with the Lord in an ongoing manner, struggling with some apostasy and turning back to Judaism. And the sum of what he's wanting to say to them he's outlining to them two different high priests. And our high priest is exalted in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary. He's ordained to offer gifts. And in verse 4, for if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law. He's an exalted minister ordained for specific service. This thread just keeps getting stronger as we see his exalted and lofty position. If the Old Testament system remained in place, he should not be in the midst. If he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law. Now, and we've already made the point that God in a very vivid way demonstrated that the ministry of the Old Testament priest was over with. Demonstrated in a very telling manner that the veil in the temple was rent from the top to the bottom. And that on the occasion of the Lord's completed sacrifice, that on the occasion of him stepping into the role of exalted and perfect high priest, having offered himself, and the Father was satisfied. Chapter 10, verse 12, once forever. And he then sat down at the right hand of God. No longer was the Old Testament system needed. Now verse 4, if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law. He wasn't in the sense that the Levitical priesthood and those that started with the line of Aaron, he wasn't out of that line. He wasn't in that sense qualified for the Old Testament priesthood, but he was a better priest. He came after the order of Melchizedek, and the writer spends a great deal of time showing how Melchizedek is superior to the Levitical priesthood, and he came after the manner and order of Melchizedek. So while it is true that if he were on earth, he's not going to be the high priest. If verse 4, if he were on earth, he should not be a high priest, seeing that there are high priests that offer gifts according to the law. But notice verse 5 qualifies verse 4 greatly. Who serve unto the example and shadow. A shadow, we'll run across that word several times, especially in Hebrews. And a shadow is a type. Something that casts a shadow shows you in a nondescript manner, in less than perfect description, less than perfect detail, but hints at whatever object is casting that shadow. So if you see a shadow on the ground, you can tell if that shadow is a barn or if it's a windmill. The shadow casts a shape on the ground, and you may not know what color it is. You may not know all the details, but you can see, well, that shadow that's cast on the barn, that's a tree on the ground. That's a tree, or it's a windmill, or it's a person. It demonstrates a general look at what was casting the shadow. And so in verse 5, he's qualifying verse 4, and the priests that are operating according to the law, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle, For, see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. So all of that building that they did, and we've already dealt with verse 5 really, all of that building they did was a shadow. And the work of the priest was an example and a shadow, which every time I come to this same point, I'm blessed. I'm thankful. I'm humbled. I am so aware of the fact that God made these types and shadows. In the words of another, He's creating a language that when Christ would enter onto the scene, we would understand. He's take all of, I mean, it's impossible to do. It's like a hypothetical what if. But take all of the Old Testament ceremonial law out of your brain. Take all the work of the high priest out of your brain. Take the pictures of the sacrifices of the animals out of your brain. Take all of that. Take the Abraham offering Isaac and God providing himself a lamb, and over there in the thicket is caught the sacrifice that you can then offer in the substitute of Isaac. Take all of that out of your brain and try to understand the coming of the Lord. Take all of those pictures, all of those types, all of those shadows, take all of that out of there and try to understand that the Lord came as a lamb to offer himself a sacrifice for sins. And you don't... And us being Gentiles, a couple thousand years removed from the New Testament days, we even see less, far less, than the Jewish person of that day, understanding at least intellectually the Old Testament, understanding at least intellectually the work of the priest in the tabernacle and the offering of sin that was made, some of it annually, some of it more, and all of that. And how gracious of God. How amazing of God that He spends 4,000 years from creation to the entrance of Christ, roughly 4,000 years, building a language that you and I can understand. That when John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb," people understand immediately, to varying degrees. They understand what John was saying by that simple sentence. Behold the Lamb. Remove all those Old Testament components and shadows and types, and you go, huh? What? A lamb. What good does that do me? I have a sin curse. I am one day going to die. I am one day going to stand before my Maker. What good's the lamb going to do me? All the good in the world. Because this lamb came to take away the sin of all who would trust Him. We have a great high priest seated in the heavenlies. We have a great high priest who ever liveth to make intercession. We have a great high priest who has provided for His people access to God based on right standing with God. That based on His own sacrifice. Talking about that, so let's read the first 5 verses, verse 6 verses. Now, of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, and not man. For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, wherefore it is of necessity that this man have somewhat also to offer. For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are high priests that offer gifts according to the law, who serve unto the example of the shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that thou makest all things according to the pattern shown unto thee in the mount. But now hath he obtained, talking about Christ, a more excellent ministry, more excellent than any earthly high priest you can imagine. He hath obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. For if the first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. We're going to stop there for today. But thinking on this, he's the basis of the better covenant, established on better promises. He is the exalted minister, ordained for specific service. He came here to save his people from their sins. He came here to be the lamb slain. And he was, that plan to be slain was written in the mind of God before the world began. He was the, Revelation 13:8, the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. And that makes all the difference in the world for those that trust him. It makes no difference in the world at all for those that reject him. But for those that trust him, they find right standing with God. No other way to find right standing with God, so that's pretty important. For those that trust him and come to God by him, they find access with God. Great intercessor. Whoever liveth to make intercession. It's the only way to have access to God. That's pretty important too. And he has provided that. God has provided that through his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. And he's spent countless hours and countless pictures trying to demonstrate so that the infinite God, who has a plan that is, the human mind could study the plan of salvation for 50 years and he'd still be learning how God saves his people from their sins and the details that go into that. And so, such a complex plan, so many intricate details, so many legal ramifications, so many practical ramifications. He did all of that to illustrate for us this one simple truth, that our minds can grasp the picture, at least in its raw simplicity. Jesus saves. No other way, no other hope, no other possibility. Jesus saves. It's as simple as that. You must come to God through Christ. He is the only way. Some of the folks here, the recipients of this letter, must have been struggling with that, must have been forgetting that, ignoring that, not trusting that, whatever the case may be. He is outlining for us his way is more excellent. Verse 6, we just read, he's obtained a more excellent ministry. Can you trust Christ? Can you hear the words of the apostle as he writes to the Hebrews? Christ is better. His way is better. The covenant is better. It's built on better promises and better sacrifice. This sacrifice was once for all. I don't mean that in the sense of once for everybody. I mean that in the sense of once and never having to be repeated, because it accomplished everything it was intended to accomplish. Once, accomplished completely, and then seated at the right hand of the Father, exalted in the heavens. Let's stand. Can you trust Christ?